China, once the powerhouse of global economic growth, is now facing a serious debt problem. This video explores how China got into this situation, what it means for the country and the world, and what might happen next. We'll look at the main causes of China's debt, including real estate issues, government borrowing, and massive infrastructure projects. We'll also examine how this affects Chinese companies, banks, local governments, and other countries that owe money to China, and discuss possible solutions to this complex problem. Now let us start with China's debt problem. China's total debt, including money owed by people, businesses, and the government, has reached 282% of the country's yearly economic output. This is higher than the US debt at 256% and other rich countries at around 270%. This huge amount of debt is worrying many experts. The debt has grown very quickly over the last 10 years. After the global financial crisis in 2008, China lent a lot of money to state-owned companies. Some people think this debt could cause big problems for China and even affect the world economy. Others say it's not as bad as it seems because most of the debt is owned by the government. What makes China's situation different is how fast the debt has grown compared to its economy. In countries like the US or Japan, debt has increased more slowly. China's debt has more than doubled compared to its economy size since 2008, making it harder to manage. China also lends money to other countries, which is less than 6% of its yearly economic output. But these loans can be politically sensitive. Some Chinese people complain that banks should have lent this money to struggling people in areas in China instead of other countries. How China got into debt. The debt problem started with the real estate market. Too many buildings were built, prices fell, and there weren't enough buyers. In the last 2 years, many real estate companies couldn't pay back money they borrowed from foreign investors. They also struggled to pay back even bigger debts to Chinese banks. Local governments have also been borrowing a lot of money over the last 10 years. They set up special financing units to borrow money for everyday expenses, paying interest on existing loans, and building things like roads, bridges, and parks. The real estate and government debt problems are closely connected. For years, local governments made money by selling land to developers. But when developers ran out of money, this income dried up. To fix this, local financing units borrowed more money to buy the land that developers couldn't afford anymore, often at high prices. All this debt has piled up quickly. According to Fitch Ratings, local governments in China owe about 30% of the country's yearly economic output. Their financing units owe an additional 40% to 50%. This debt crisis didn't happen overnight. It's been building up for years, with real estate problems and government borrowing making each other worse. Understanding the infrastructure boom and LGFVs. Over the past decade, China has built an enormous amount of infrastructure, roads, bridges, subways, and more. This building spree has been bigger than anything the world has ever seen before. It has been a major driver of China's rapid economic growth in recent years. The companies that borrowed money to finance these developments are called Local Government Financing Vehicles, LGFVs. These LGFVs borrow money from banks or sell bonds to fund their projects. In total, the amount they owe is about equal to half of China's GDP. This is a massive amount of debt. LGFVs have been very successful at transforming China's urban environment. They've built impressive infrastructure all across the country. However, they haven't been very good at making money. This is because much of the infrastructure they build is either free or very cheap for the public to use. As a result, they'll probably never be able to pay back all the debt they've borrowed for these projects. But here's the interesting part. This might actually be okay. To understand why, we need to remember that this debt is part of the wealth of Chinese banks. The banks are happy as long as the LGFVs are giving them a steady income stream by paying their interest. So far, LGFVs have been able to keep paying their interest thanks to help from their local government owners. As the economy grows, local governments get more income, which they give to the LGFVs to help them pay their interest. When it's time for LGFVs to pay back the main amount they borrowed, the principal, the banks have been willing to say, "Don't worry, you can pay us later." This system has worked well so far, and LGFVs have always been able to make payments on their bonds. The LGFV crack problem and its implications. A few years ago, China's leaders in Beijing started worrying that LGFVs were wasting resources that could be used better elsewhere in China's new high-tech sectors. So, they sent a message to local governments: stop promising to support your LGFVs if they get into trouble, and see if they can support themselves. This created a new problem. Because local governments had stopped promising to be a backstop, banks started thinking maybe they wouldn't roll over the debt like they did before. And if they did, they would demand a higher interest rate. The issue is that LGFVs in poorer areas of China are never going to be able to support themselves. At the same time, because of an end to the boom in apartment sales, China's local governments have seen their income slowing dramatically. This means they have less money to give to the LGFVs they own. This could lead to LGFVs failing to pay interest on their bonds, suddenly making those bonds much less valuable. Banks would then become less wealthy than they thought they were. We can all remember from the 2008 financial crisis what happens when banks lose their wealth. It can be a huge shock to the financial system. In the worst case, they can stop lending entirely, crushing the economy. Possible solutions and future outlook. Fixing China's debt problem won't be easy or quick. The country needs to slowly move away from relying on debt-fueled government projects and big national security spending. Instead, it should focus on an economy driven by consumer spending and services. But this change will be difficult because powerful groups in Beijing and other cities want to keep things as they are. China's leaders in Beijing don't want a financial crisis, but they also don't want to just bail out all of these companies. They think that would send the wrong message about wasteful borrowing. Local governments are going to have to keep doing everything they can to ensure their LGFVs carry on making their payments. But if Beijing isn't going to bail them out, then local governments will need to cut down spending on other areas, including on infrastructure, to make sure that the bond payments are made. This means we won't see a repeat of the infrastructure boom of the last decade, and China will likely grow more slowly over the next decade. Some experts worry that China might face a crisis like other countries that saw rapid debt increases and then had economic problems. However, others argue that China is less likely to have a severe economic downturn because number 1, it has very little overseas debt. Number 2, it has a high national savings rate. Number 3, most of its debt is owned by the state. This means the government has more control over the situation and might be able to manage the debt more effectively. Last winter, 21 Chinese banks agreed to let a local government financing unit in southwestern China take longer to repay its loans. They allowed the unit to pay only interest for the first 10 years. This helped the local government but meant big losses for the banks. Almost every province in China has similar financing units in trouble. The challenge for China now is to find a balance between managing its debt, maintaining economic growth, and shifting towards a more sustainable economic model. This will likely involve these 5 steps. Number 1, gradually reducing reliance on infrastructure spending and real estate development. Number 2, encouraging consumer spending and developing the service sector. Number 3, improving the efficiency and profitability of state-owned enterprises. Number 4, carefully managing the debt of local governments and LGFVs. Number 5, continuing to support strategic industries while allowing less productive sectors to shrink. Chinese companies and debt. Since 2008, Chinese companies have been borrowing more and more money. By 2023, corporate debt in China reached nearly 160% of GDP. More than half of this debt is held by state-owned enterprises, SOEs, which often don't make much profit. Looking at 1,891 medium to large companies, we see a worrying trend. The number of companies with healthy debt levels has decreased by nearly 32% since 2008. Meanwhile, more companies are either losing money or have unhealthy debt levels. Even Chinese companies listed in Hong Kong, which are usually considered healthier due to stricter rules, are having problems. Out of 93 companies listed since 2011, the number with good financial health dropped from 66 to 49 by December 2021. Impact on banks. As more borrowers struggle to repay loans, banks are seeing more bad debts. Officially, bad loans at Chinese commercial banks total around 1.5 trillion yuan. But some experts think the real number could be up to 14 times higher because banks often hide the true figures. Why debt matters. Borrowing money can be good for governments and businesses if they use it wisely, but when they borrow too much without making enough money to pay it back, they can get into trouble. This is what's happening in China. As the economy slows down, local governments and their financing units are finding it hard to keep up with interest payments. This means many local areas don't have enough money for important things like public services, healthcare, or pensions. It's also making it hard for Chinese banks to accept losses on loans to poorer countries. Global impact. China is the biggest lender to developing countries. In 2010, only 5% of China's overseas loans to borrowers were in financial trouble. Now, it's 60%. As interest rates in the West have gone up, developing countries are finding it harder to pay back their loans to China. If nothing is done to reduce this debt, Many of the world's poorest countries will keep spending a lot of their money on debt repayments instead of on schools, hospitals, and other important services. China's debt situation is a complex challenge that requires careful management and smart decisions. The country must balance its massive infrastructure investments with the need for sustainable growth. If China can successfully change its economy without causing a financial crisis, it might avoid the problems that have affected other countries. However, if it fails, the consequences could be significant not just for China but for the global economy. The world is watching closely to see what happens next. What do you guys think about the China debt situation? Do you think that it is possible for China to default on its debt? Please put your comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.